Happy birthday, Northampton Township. It's 1997, and we are celebrating our 275th anniversary. Hi, I'm Ginny Geyer of the Northampton Township Historical Commission. We thought it would be a nice project to record some of the existing old buildings in the township as a birthday present to the community. The structures that you will see are from the 1700s and 1800s. I now would like to introduce you to Jeff Marshall.
Thank you, Virginia. I'm Jeff Marshall, Director of Historic Preservation at Heritage Conservancy in Doylestown, and I will be your guide as we go through these historic buildings, and I will point out architectural elements and details which make these buildings worth preserving. Thank you. This is an extremely large house here on Sackett's Ford Road. What's unusual about it is it's virtually 3 stories tall and 6 bays wide. By bay, I mean an entrance door or entranceway or window width. It's, like I say, almost 3 stories tall. The upper windows are often called a frieze window in the Greek revival jargon, but people often call them lie on your stomach or eyebrow windows because that's what they look like. Houses like this generally were built about 1850 to 1860, or very often they were actually older structures that were expanded and raised until they look like this about that period of time. We are looking at a unique 18th and early 19th century refrigeration system. What is right behind me is a barrel vault and ice house combination. The small masonry structure you see at the front with the gable roof and the overhang is an entranceway. What you would do is go down a long set of stone stairs into an open room. The room would have a round top vaulted room which was used to store vegetables and other root goods, and beyond it, in the square section, is an ice house. The ice house was used during the summertime to keep ice cold. Ice would be harvested from the nearby creeks or ponds or streams, brought in, lowered down, coated with layers of sawdust, and kept for the use during the summertime month. These things were apparently very common at one time, but over the years have a tendency to become destroyed as the mounds begin to crumble or as they find alternative uses. In order to get the ice back up from the lower levels, often these houses would have these cranks here that were designed as a hoist to lift the large sheets of ice back on up. Again, these things would often be usable well into the summer and would be used for ice cream and all the other things you think of today where you want a nice cold drink. People in the 18th and 19th century would love the same type of cold things on a hot summer day the way we would. This is an unusual and very elegant fireplace mantel. It has fluted pilasters, but the whole mantelpiece across the top with the elliptical designs is quite unusual. And the corner blocks is something that is very rare to see. It's a formal parlor fireplace as compared to a large cooking fireplace. We're now in the kitchen wing of the house on Sackett's Ford Road, and by comparison, you have a large walk-in fireplace, which was a cooking fireplace, and a whole different feel to this room as compared to the rest of the house. This is not very formal at all. Window jambs are more traditional wooden windows as compared to the very generous Greek Revival influenced quarter-round windows. Very often you could not even get from the kitchen wing to the rest of the house via upstairs, as the kitchen help would live above the kitchen or in the out kitchen, and the rest of the family would live in their part of the house. As we go up the winding stairway with its pie-shaped treads, notice how narrow the treads are, and not many of these winding stairs had railings. This is certainly no place for high-heeled shoes. This is an example of an upstairs mantel. It's smaller, not quite as fancy as a downstairs mantel, but still a very good example of Greek Revival architecture. One thing interesting is that the pilasters are symmetrical, and this top piece is actually just the same pattern replicated twice, and has a very simple corner blocks, in this case the shape of lozenges or diamonds, and it is a good example of a mid-19th century fireplace, just for warming a room, not for cooking or any other purpose. We're now up on the third floor of the house, and you can see why these frieze windows are often called lie-on-your-stomach windows. They are about at my shin level or ankle level, and to really look out of them, you have to lay down on your stomach in order to use them. They do give a lot of light and ventilation on a third floor, making it much more usable. We're on the grounds of the Villa Joseph Marie property on Holland Road. This property was originally settled in the 1740s by Adrian Cornell. 100 years later, a little bit more, in 1860, the original house was replaced by a huge Italianate-style structure. Behind me is the only remnant we have of the original settlement, and that is a smokehouse. In the agrarian period of the 18th century, one had to prepare all their own meats for curing, and that was generally done in a small stone structure called a smokehouse. You could tell from the louvered vents rather than windows that this was designed so that the smoke could escape, but not too quickly. It is a very simple structure, basically a stone box with a roof, and what's interesting about it is there's actually a date stone on it that shows the original date of the building. Remarkably, in modern Bucks County, the Sisters of Villa Joseph Marie actually used this for smoking of hams until the 1950s. This smokehouse was actually built in two sections. One section was a smoking chamber. You can tell this is the smoking chamber because of the soot and the fact that there are rods suspended across the top from which you can see the hooks from which the hams and other meats were hung. And the other section, which was simply used for storage. Again, making use of the stone structure for more than one purpose. We're on Bristol Road at a historic house known as Carrollton, which is named for the Carroll family, which was here early in the 18th century. There is, in fact, a date painted up in the date stone alcove of 1711, which may reflect when the original house on this property was constructed for the Carroll family. Here we're looking at Carrollton from this main elevation. It's a beautiful stuccoed stone house. Many of the old houses in Northampton, as throughout Bucks County, although built of stone, were designed to be stuccoed. The stucco gave it a much more sophisticated, elegant look, and also actually acted as a vapor barrier to keep the moisture out of a house. This house was built in several sections, and often houses were stuccoed to blend the sections together into one unified appearance. It is a much more sophisticated and elegant look, and really is getting rarer and rarer to find houses that have maintained stucco. We are standing underneath a porch on the kitchen end of the house. We can tell it's the kitchen because this piece of stone that I'm leaning on is the end of a stone sink. The rest of the stone sink is actually on the inside of the house. You would do your dishes and your washing. The water would be conveyed out through a hole here and would just run out onto the ground below. Over beyond here is the entrance to what was originally a bake oven. There was a large structure that came out of here called a beehive oven, and if you look real carefully, you can see where there was a roof structure here that protected it. You would, from the inside of the house, in the back of a large walk-in fireplace, you would fill this with coals, warm it up, brush out the coals, and then the radiant heat of the brick or the stone would bake your bread and your other baked goods. We are now on the inside of Carrollton, in the kitchen wing. This was the big, and is a big walk-in fireplace. It was larger at one time, having actually spanned the entire distance. The bake oven opening we saw on the outside of the building would have been gained through this fireplace. This was, as I said, the kitchen wing, perhaps the oldest extant part of the building as well. Functionally, a house couldn't survive without a cooking fireplace. Other aspects of this room which are of interest are a unique feature known as a paymaster window. Underneath some of the windows, there are drawers which, as the story goes, the property owner would pay his hired help. They would come up to the window and get paid through the window. Probably the more accurate version of what really they were designed for was a way to use the space beneath the window. When you have to break through the stone, 18 inches of stone for one of these houses, you can build in a little bit of cabinetry and little space by using the hole that you've already dug and making a drawer out of it. This is unusual in that there are two small drawers rather than one large drawer. Of course, every old house needed one of these, a privy. This one is a very nice one in that it was built for an entire family to use. It has two adult-size holes and two child-size holes on the side. It is a very useful piece of farm architecture, which is rapidly disappearing, and it's something that should also be chronicled in our study of Northampton Township. This is the Jacksonville Schoolhouse. In the year 1800, the landowner leased a lot for 99 years to the township for a school so the neighborhood children can get an education. By 1860, the original building was replaced with this current structure. It is a simple stone one-room building, and until a few years ago, it even had a bell tower. Like most schools, the entry is through the gable end rather than through the long wall. The story was told that the schoolchildren walked across the dirt road twice a day to the spring house of the blacksmith's home to get fresh drinking water. The teacher always sent 2 boys or 2 girls, never 1 boy and 1 girl, to carry the water bucket. The historic name for this house is the Horace Cornell House. The Horace Cornell House is very typical of some of the finer houses built in Northampton during the 18th century. The smaller section is a very simple 1.5-story stone cabin. Again, very typical of the houses being built here in the 1740s in Northampton. Attached to it is the main formal section of the house. It is a center hall, federal-style house, most typically found between the 1780s and 1820s in this part of Bucks County. It is a very sophisticated house by comparison to the older, more simple stone cabin. As we go around the house, you see some very interesting architectural features. Most noticeably, here on the corners are the very finely cut stone coins or corner blocks. Another architectural element are the very nicely cut keystones above the first floor windows. And finally, when you come around to the front door on the southeast or front side of the house, you will see very delicately carved gouge work in the federal-style doorway. The north side of the house is not as formal as the south side. The south side had 5 windows or door openings that were symmetrical. Here on the north side, or back of the house, they didn't care so much for symmetry. Plus the north wind made it colder, so they had fewer openings. You do have one unique window above the door located at a slightly lower level than the other windows on the second floor. That is a landing window. There was a landing at this point, and the stairs turn and go back in the other direction. In the 18th and 19th century, it was nice to have some natural lighting so you didn't end up falling down the stairs and injuring yourself. The section to the far right is the rear of the early 18th century house, which is offset from the other structure. Here is a beautiful example of a federal period mantelpiece. If you look at it carefully, you notice the detailed cuttings and carvings and gouge work made by a drill and a narrow gouge. This one is incredibly detailed, all handwork, and a remarkable example of federal period architecture. The federal period is generally 1780s to 1820s, but here in Bucks County we're a little bit slower than some parts of the country, and most commonly this is found around 1800 to 1820. The house is also interesting in that the windows, which are extremely tall 9/9 windows, have paneled jambs. Just another sophistication that you don't find in all old houses. We're in another parlor now, and as you can see, this fireplace is much different than the last one we saw. It has a much more sophisticated look. It still has the gouge work, but no drill work. It has flat pilasters and a less federal-looking appearance. It is a little more of the Greek Revival style, but still a very handsome and appropriate fireplace for the early 19th century. And to the right of the fireplace, we see a door which leads into the old section of the house, which is now the kitchen wing. This is a walk-in fireplace, one of the largest you will see anywhere. It is massive. It has very heavy mantle, and you can still see where the bake oven extended out beyond the wall. This room is typical of the 18th century. It has a paymaster's window, as we mentioned earlier. The section of the house also has very large exposed beams. The beams are beaded, indicating they were meant to be exposed. And the floorboards of the second floor are also very wide and exposed. If you look, you'll see where the stovepipe once extended through the second floor as a means of heating the upstairs. And here are the original box stairs in the kitchen wing of the house. The stairs to the right would have wound downstairs, and the stair to the left would have gone up to the second floor. The stairway is completely boxed in, hence the name box stairs. And notice at the end of it how wide this one board is. Just an incredible 18-inch wide hand-planed piece of wood. The stairway also has very nice 5-panel doors and beautiful traditional iron hardware. I also want to show you something here on the door. This is a keyhole-shaped lock with a lift latch, and it is believed to have come from England. It has a very heavy keeper. The blacksmith's house is a simple vernacular or folk-style building. There's not much to it. It was just a tenant house, probably. But even a simple house has several interesting features. This house has large coins or corner blocks, and there is a massive chimney, although it has a new flue on top. There is an attic window on the gable end of the house. But the most intriguing window is the one that's just tucked underneath the roof line. Now let's go inside. We're on Jacksonville Road, what's called the Blacksmith House. There was a blacksmith shop on the property. We're directly across the street from the Jacksonville School. This is the large walk-in fireplace with closets on both sides, and then a winding stair going up to the upper level. The ceiling of this house is nice in that it's an exposed floor above and simple wooden beams. The house was built as a tenant house, we think. Not very ornamented, relatively plain and simple. There's no detailed trim around the windows either. It's a simple, vernacular, folk-style house. Our next stop on our historic tour of Northampton Township is a place called China Mission, and it's one of the most sophisticated houses in the township. It was built, we think, in either the late 18th century or early 19th century, and is a remarkable example of the Greek Revival style. There are actually photographs of the house from the early 20th century which showed it with a two-story, very ornate portico, much like the White House or some sophisticated Greek Revival buildings you find in either Philadelphia or big cities throughout the region. The house is unique for Northampton and not your typical old Bucks County stone farmhouse for a couple of reasons. One, if you notice right away at the top of that building, it has a hip roof. And that means all 4 slopes of the roof are at an angle rather than 2, which is a typical gable roof. Unique about this hip roof is the tiny little dormer window located in the center. The building is stuccoed and is, for that reason, also relatively unique here in Northampton Township. The house is particularly gracious. It has very ornate, tall chimneys, 4 chimneys with a corbelled cap, and floor-to-ceiling length windows on the first floor, which traditionally would have been open, but which through the years have been altered and hopefully will be restored in the near future. The doorway is very ornate. It is a double-wide doorway. It has a very ornate transom with tracery above, and again, represents the sophistication of its early owners. The first thing that impresses you when you come in a house like this is its very size. The ceilings are tremendously tall. I did not shrink since the last house we went to. And the level of ornamentation on all the windows and the door surrounds is unparalleled. Ceilings are very sophisticated with plastered ornamentation. And as we turn the corner, you'll see a very gracious and elegant staircase that leads up to the second floor. parlor of China Mission is also quite dramatic. It has a unique mantelpiece and some very, very beautiful plasterwork along the ceiling, highlighted by a center medallion of plaster. The windows also include the trim similar to what we saw in the foyer. The main room on the first floor of China Mission is the dining room. And like the other rooms, it has a very ornate mantel. This one different than the one in the parlor, with full columns rather than pilasters. And like the other rooms, it has an extremely ornate medallion of plaster in the ceiling. This one has fruit representing the fact that this room was for eating. One of the most remarkable things about this house are the doors. They are tremendously thick, huge doors, and the level of detailing is remarkable. Even the jambs, the ends of the doors, are all carved. We're at the Jacob Cornell House, one of Northampton's fine examples of Federal period architecture. The main house is built in 1832 and is highlighted by a beautiful fanlight and the cut stone that surrounds it. But the house is actually built in several sections. The section to the left of the main house actually predates the large section. It is dated from 1790. There's a date stone on the back of the house, and it's typical of the small stone houses that were more common in the 18th century here in Northampton. What's interesting about it is there's a date stone on the gable end here, which JVC for Jacob V. Cornell in the year 1863, but it's actually on the part of the building that has the date stone on the front of 1832, and it probably reflects when an addition or alteration was made, perhaps this rear wing being extended out to the right. This is the 1790 section of the Jacob Cornell house, and it has a lot of features typical of an 18th century Bucks County farmhouse. We have a winding set of stairs. One stair would go up, the other stair would wind down. In this case, the HL hinges are later replacements, but you see another feature that you often find in winding stairs, and there's some scarring from when one door is left open while the other door is then opened. Typically, if you had generations of children who would go up and down the stairs without closing the other one, you get that. Beyond the stairway, we have a large cooking fireplace. This one is a little bit more remarkable than some we've seen for the fact that the sides of it are made with huge cut and quarried stone. It's also interesting in that it has retained its Dutch oven or bake oven door in the back. And to the right of it, we see a typical 6/6 window, and underneath the window is the drawer, which people often call a paymaster or Bible drawer. This is the center hall of the Jacob Cornell house. It's a very sophisticated stairway with nice turned balusters. But what I like about it is the nice sweep and curve to the landing. And it shows a lot of detail, a lot of effort in making this. This is made out of wood, and took a lot of time and effort to make that work. Typically, as you see in these old houses, you would come in the front door, there's a stairway here, and this would have been door out the back. Now we're in one of the parlors of the Jacob Cornell house. The door to my right leads out into the kitchen wing, so this was probably used as a dining room at one time. It's nice because of the beautiful mantel, unlike any other mantel we've seen so far, and it has also unique paneling along the end wall. We're at Twin Trees, the Richard Leadham House here in Richborough, one of the few houses in Northampton that's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The house is built in two sections. The main section to the left is known as the Richard Leadham House. The smaller section to the right predates that, dates about 1740. The main section is pretty remarkable for its beautiful cut keystones above the windows and the cut stone known as ashlar stonework throughout. It is an excellent example of Federal period architecture. It has large 8/8 windows on the first floor, slightly smaller ones on the second, paneled shutters on the first floor, louvered blinds on the second, which was done to allow security at night. We closed them on the first floor and let ventilation on the second floor. Above the second floor windows is a ornate cornice that has very classical elements, including what are called dentils, or teeth in the Greek, and modillions, which are large brackets underneath the cornice. The house was built by or for Richard Leadham, who was a wealthy merchant, storekeeper, tavern operator here in Richboro, and is on the National Register of Historic Places. Its other historic name is Twin Trees, and its name is obvious because of the large sycamores that were planted in front of the house. 18th century settlers would often plant trees in front of the house, and especially deciduous trees, to block the summer sun and allow the winter sun to penetrate. To the right of the main house is a smaller house, and it is typical of what you find in Northampton in that it's a small one-story stone house, and the end wall of it is extended out to form an enclosed work area, probably patterned after the Dutch stoop, which would give you a place to work outside the kitchen and keep you protected from the elements. This feature is almost unique to Northampton Township here in Bucks County. We don't have very many other houses outside of Northampton that has this feature. Although impossible to prove, it seems logical that Northampton, with a strong Dutch population, brought this building tradition from someplace else, rather than the typical Quaker houses that you see throughout the remainder of southern Bucks County. We're in the old section of Twin Trees Farm, and it is a remarkable room. This section dates from the 1740s and has a lot of features that you would find in old Bucks County farmhouses. These were the doors that would go winding up and then through, and they have a couple things that I want to point out. The hinges here are called H or HL hinges, depending on their shape. They're made out of wrought iron. They have wrought iron handmade nails attaching them. The door itself is wide panels. Notice the nice beading here, which was a sign of sophistication. And what's interesting are the hinges. The hinges are what are called Suffolk latches, wrought iron thumb latches, blacksmiths made, very irregular. These are called bean-shaped cusps. And they're all very typical of the mid-18th century. Other things about the house that are pretty remarkable are the fact that you can tell this was once a door, and it's been changed through the years. There's a built-in cupboard, which is probably a little bit later. Chair rail goes around the room, and another interesting doorway with, again, the Suffolk latch, a straight lift latch. This is what the inside would look like. And in this room is a stone sink. The 18th century lady of the house would use this, fill it with water, and it would actually go out through the stone wall to the outside. So you would bring water in, but you wouldn't have to dump the water out. And of course, like every housewife, she wanted a window by her kitchen sink. And that's why you have a tiny little window right in that room. Across on the same wall is a huge walk-in fireplace. Remarkable about this, and it's hard to see, but through the centuries, this mantel has been decorated by dozens, if not more, initials all throughout here of different people who have lived in the house. Over here, you have the opening to what was called a Dutch oven or a bake oven. It would have had a door over it. There's a little slot where the door was, and you would feed coals into there, heat it up, rake out the coals, and the radiant heat of the stone would cook or bake your baked goods. What's also interesting about this fireplace, which is so big, is it has another window in it. And that presumably was for the easy loading of firewood. I mean, this is pretty unusual. You don't see that very often anywhere. One of the nice features about old houses are old windows. The 18th century glassmaking was not as good as it is today, and there were a lot of imperfections. And having wavy glass or bubbles in the glass was very typical of an 18th century house. And one of the things that added a lot of charm to old houses today. The ceiling in this room has been exposed. It was originally plastered, much like the walls, although with lath. And lath are thin pieces of wood to which you would apply the plaster. And you can see the shadow mark of where the lath was, and the white lines you see between the shadow marks is where the plaster oozed up between the tiny pieces of wood forming what are called keys that would spread out, and that would actually hold the plaster on. This one is rough hewn, and it has a summer beam, which is the large beam used to bridge the very deep depth of this room. One last thing I want to point out about this room is the plasterwork. This is what you typically would have, interior plaster, and it's done in several levels. You have the stone, and beneath the stone you have what's called a brown coat. And in order for this brown coat of plaster to bind to itself, it has horsehair. And the horsehair would actually help keep it together, and then you have a final smooth white coat above. But 18th century houses are very typical to have horsehair or animal hair as a binder in order to keep the plaster attached. Here on the second floor, the old part of Twin Trees, you have a really interesting arrangement. You have a very informal vernacular or folk house. It has a small fireplace with a hearth. It has a wide plank partition, and typical of upstairs in old houses, it has a wide plank floor, a random width floor. In the 18th century, random width was not something you wanted to have. It was less expensive and therefore relegated to the upper levels. You would have the more sophisticated cut floors on the first floor where people could see them. And today, a lot of people rob the floors from upstairs when they want to renovate a house to have the random width floors. In keeping with the less formal upstairs, you have a Suffolk latch in the front, but you have an old-style wooden latch as a way to secure the door. The Richard Leedham house has a lot of sophisticated features about it. Here we have a fireplace where you have a very large, ornate overmantel with detailing. Shoulders or crossettes is what we call those little features where the molding jogs out. And this feature is found throughout this house, not just on the fireplaces and the overmantels, but around all the doors and windows as well. It's just one of those things that showed the extra detail and the extra sophistication in a more elegant house. The Richard Leedham house is a center hall colonial or federal house, and in the center hall was a stairway. And this is a very nice stairway. It's got a landing on it. Going up the stairs, there's dado or wainscoting going all the way up. And tucked underneath the stair landing is the back door. This door is pretty remarkable in that it has large strap hinges, which is not very sophisticated, but a more utilitarian type of approach. And it's actually two doors thick. And if you were to get close and look at it in detail, you can see a decorative nail pattern of where the double thickness of doors were attached. It was done for security purposes. This house is interesting in that the rooms we were already in had typical fireplaces against the end wall. But this half of the house has back-to-back corner fireplaces. They are very detailed in the front of the house and less detailed in the back. That's pretty typical of the 18th century. This would have been the best parlor, so this has the best parlor mantel. The parlor that is on the other side that goes behind this fireplace is similar in detail, only slightly less ornamented. One of the most amazing discoveries in the Richard Leedham house is in the basement. What you see here is a root cellar, or what we call a barrel vault. And this originally would have been underground. But when they built the 1779 addition to the old house, instead of destroying it, they built around it. And it's a remarkable structure. And the fact that it's exposed gives us an opportunity to see how these things were actually constructed. One of the things that is remarkable about it, I think, is it's arched, of course, and the doorway is arched. And it's cut in an arch, and you can still see where the pegs were when it was originally assembled. One of the interesting things about old houses are things that you don't often see. We're standing in the basement of the Richard Leedham house, and you see a beautiful stone arch whose sole purpose was to support the hearth of the fireplaces above. The arch was used as a way to spread the weight, but also as a way not to use up stone. Otherwise, if you didn't have an arch, you would have to make this a solid pier. And these things are beautiful pieces of construction and are were designed not to be seen, but just purely functional. They have a little ledge here, which is often used then to put a board across to give them some function for shelving. But for the most part, their sole purpose was to hold the stone of the hearth above. In the attic of the lead-in section of the house, we see the old ladder used by the homeowner when there was a fire on the wooden roof. Fires occasionally were started by escaping live embers from the chimney. The homeowner would have to throw back the escape hatch to the roof and try to put out the fire with buckets of water. One thing you see in even the most out-of-the-way places is the detail and craftsmanship in many old houses. The joinery in this attic is remarkable. You see cut pegs and Roman numerals on the roof rafters and collar ties. These roofs were actually assembled on the ground, then taken apart, and then hoisted up to the roof level. The Roman numerals assured the proper reassembly. People often ask, why are they Roman numerals? Are they that old? And I say, no. Have you ever tried to make a number 8 with a chisel? I hope you enjoyed our short walk through Northampton Township's history. We hope this project will encourage the preservation of these very important historic resources for future generations. Thank you very much.